I would like to start by asking you, how would you describe the main roles of a chief economist at the DWP?
It was to lead an analytical team, lead and indeed develop an analytical team that will be able to suggest solutions and analyse the body of evidence bearing on whether people could make appropriate choices about pension accumulation and the, if you like, the social impact of pensions and the systems surrounding them. One of the principal concerns that we had when I started in that job in 2003 was that the income of pensioners seemed likely to drop in the future. State pensions had been being reduced for some time. There had been a policy of non-indexation under the Thatcher governments in the 80s and continuing right up until well into the 90s. And there was also then concern about the decline in contributions into private pensions, workplace pensions and personal pensions, somewhat masked by statistical errors, which were another of the things that we concerned ourselves with. And the worry was that this was becoming a kind of unsustainable situation, that pension incomes would start dropping at some stage in the future, and there didn't seem to be a means of combating that. So that was the situation I came into, and that's what I conceived very much as the principal task. Of course, the analytical director also concerns themselves with regular surveys and model building, other things that go on in the analytical directorate.
What were then the ideas, the views, the perspectives around pensions before the establishment?
Right, so where I came in, there was a strong mandate for something called informed choice, which was a policy put forward by the Treasury, which said basically people would make appropriate choices about long-term financial instruments like pensions if they were provided with sufficient information. And when I came in, indeed Helen Dean, now head of Nest Corporation, was heading a series of projects to try and see whether they could make headway with the informed choice approach. And I very clearly remember when we came to the end of those projects and we found that any amount of detailed, conscientious, highly effective work to try and make people more aware of their options, more aware of what they should be doing, had essentially no effect. And I think it was at that point that, for me, was, if you like, a trigger point, which said, okay, we found a very strong negative result. Those are the things that are most powerful in a research context when you've tried hard to prove something and found you can't. So you then need to look for something else. So it was that point that we really started looking at what might be done if the informed choice approach, which, as I say, was a Treasury initiative, was not going to be pursued or couldn't be effective. So it was at that point that I set my staff on, and indeed myself started looking for alternatives. And the auto-enrollment approach of changing the default from one of not saving in a pension unless you decided to do so, to changing in a pension unless you decided to opt out, became the thing we decided to work on very intensively.
From focusing on an informed choice to the formation of a pensions commission.
I guess that's one way of seeing it. I mean, the way it was put to me when I was taking the job was that I was hired to work on pension reform. And a very clever and well-informed friend of mine who was in the Treasury, who was indeed a Treasury spokesman at that point, said, well, your problem, Robert, is going to be that Blair is reform and Brown is pensions. Tony Blair was interested in reform. Gordon Brown was interested in it, was the person who conceived himself to be in charge of pensions.
Yes.
And was actually not going to agree to any reform of a system which he very much conceived himself as being in charge of. And so my friend was saying, you're going to be at a roadblock, and there's no point in taking this job, it can't go anywhere.
Given these circumstances, how do you think the Commission managed to reach this solid consensus?
Well, of course, an enormous amount is down to the commissioners themselves and the huge amount of public work they did. But I think there was also a very considerable role in terms of the preparation that both the analytical directorate and the policy directorates within the DWP actually did. So it was we, as I say, who started the process of reaching out to American academics, particularly David Laibson, to bring in information about how automatic enrollment into pensions and automatic escalators were actually working in the US in a slightly different context. It was in the context of willing employers adopting that approach rather than a national approach. And we also started a process of negotiating with key stakeholders, or making sure that key stakeholders were constantly informed in the process. So those were two important contributions. If I was to highlight a contribution I I think to some extent was my personal contribution, was the idea of National Pensions Day, using the approach of deliberative polling. Again, something that comes out of the American academic tradition. So this is James Fishkin, currently at the Center for Deliberative Democracy in Stanford, was one of the people I contacted to set up National Pensions Day as, if you like, a representative sample of the UK population brought together in 4 or 5 locations around the country to debate pension reform and what should be done. So to try and get an idea of what it was that the representative person in the population thought, because there's a very low level of information in the population as a whole. People have to be educated. So if you like, a standard poll just asking people their opinion doesn't get you to the answer. Equally, a focus group where you might be able to provide them with a lot of information and tell them what expert views are could be a lot more informed, but is not representative. So that's why we went for the approach, or decided to push for the approach of a deliberative poll with 1,000 people who were statistically representative, but also informed by the experts. So those, I think, were the key contributions that the department made to the Pension Commission process.
So one of the success factors was engage the citizens.
Absolutely.
With the pension problem, or with a
well, both with the pension problem and with the solution. I mean, it was a much more extensive process, of course, than National Pensions Day, but the idea was, if you like, government departments and bodies like the Pension Commission are used to working with stakeholders. But if they reach out to stakeholders, what they nearly always get is a relatively small group of people with specialist interest, but who don't represent public opinion. So the DWP, for example, worked with 14 key stakeholders across trade unions, employers, research organizations, consumer organizations, and a number of others, to try and gauge opinion and make sure that the proposals that were being developed didn't stray off into territory that would be unacceptable to any of those parties. But the point of the public debate and the Pensions Commission seizing on the idea of National Pensions Day and pushing it forward and making it happen was that there was actually a public consensus behind that, which said to the stakeholders, okay, there's something out there in the public mind that is really important to people. And one of the things we'd found, and indeed Helen and others found out in the informed choice research, was that people, when confronted with the idea, are you satisfied with what you're doing about your pension? Are you worried about your pension? A frequent response of members of the public was to burst into tears when they were asked that question. They were so uncertain about what they should be doing that they had pushed this whole issue of what's going to happen to my pension, what provision have I got for old age, completely to one side, but it was clearly bothering them. And so, as I say, that was the reactions were frequently quite emotional. And I think that was one of the powers of automatic enrolment. There was the huge sense of relief that it brought to people when they were faced with the notion that something would be done for them which they didn't have to decide about. They could be reasonably sure it was the right thing for them to do, was to go along with what they were being enrolled into. There wasn't that much controversy about it in people's minds. It was just the sense, at last I can actually be given something that's, if you like, implicit advice and then action on the basis of that advice.
Or do you think that the lack of an event like this will erode the consensus in the long run?
I don't think it's necessarily the case you need to rebuild that same consensus again. I think the consensus is certainly there that people needed to do more than they were doing in the pre-Pension Commission situation. I think some of the value of National Pensions Day was thrown away. In best practice for those sorts of exercises, you retain at least a subsample out of the 1,000 people you've seen, you brought together, and you then test reactions to subsequent bits of the program with that subsample. So best practice would have been to keep a group of, say, 100 in more or less constant contact with the pension reform over the years as it developed. That wasn't actually done. So as I say, I think some of the value that potentially could have come from such an exercise was lost. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the exercise was fruitless. I think it had considerable value in itself. I would imagine there would be a case if there were major changes to be made again in the future to this, or indeed anything else, in terms of government policy, for strongly considering an equivalent event. I mean, I personally consider that the situation with Brexit is an absolutely classic case where something like National Pensions Day, a national deliberative event or process, is absolutely necessary, because it's the only way you can get a legitimate consensus. A consensus is based on what the citizenry think and is based on information. And that seems to me its great strength. For the pension debate at the moment, I think it's gone into much more detailed questions, important questions, but they're questions of implementation, They're questions of detailed design. I don't think you necessarily need to bring the whole national pension state apparatus back together for that purpose.
The reason that I'm asking you is because still people do not engage with their pension pots.
Well, that's absolutely right, and you can certainly see that. This is one of the things that my current role brings me in Zurich Independent Governance Committee, absolutely brings me face to face with. People do not know what's in their pension pot. They don't engage with it. I think it's on the latest research we've done, something like 80% of Zurich's plan holders don't know what's in their fund. Even if they say they know, and you ask them, well, how much is in your fund? On average, they're making an error of about a quarter. So they're really quite seriously in error, which particularly for people who are depending on a policy from a single place and don't have any other retirement resources can be a very serious matter. But as I say, where this process started for me was with the informed choice pilots and the finding that you cannot get people to engage with that. There's always been a hope and an expectation that by doing more education, by providing more information, you'll actually change that. What I think the lesson of behavioral economics is no, you won't. What you can do is guide people towards reasonably safe outcomes for them without them having to inform themselves. So, if you like, by setting off down the road to auto-enrollment, you've done somewhat the same as you would have done if you'd gone down the route of compulsion in Australia. You've made it unnecessary for people to have that detailed understanding of their own situation. You've told them you're going to get to something like a safe place almost automatically.
The last years we have seen a general turn in policy from mainstream economics, a shift to behavioral economics. And I think pensions is a prime example of this. What are the reasons for this turn in policy? What do you think?
I think it's been a major change, but I don't think it's by any means the only determining philosophy. So, for example, the idea of pension freedoms came in under Chancellor George Osborne a few years later, which actually moved in completely the opposite direction. What had previously been essentially a default behaviour, which was that you took your pension pot and you put it into an annuity and you drew that income for the rest of your life, was then made much more optional. And so that headed in a very different direction from what behavioural economics would suggest was appropriate. So it's not just one way or the other. I also think that behavioural economics can be seen as a manipulation of public preferences. So I think to deploy it safely, you have to be a lot more scrupulous than just saying it's going to produce the answer we want. You've got to be absolutely certain, or as certain as you reasonably can be, that what you're going to be doing is not only in the public interest, but is in the interest of all the individuals. So one of the jobs we had to do in the analytical directorate was to test, if you like, to destruction against every group we could identify in the population, whether making them save into, or what was almost making them save into a pension was going to be good for them, the so-called pays to save analysis. And it was one of the things that took most time and frankly almost drove me crazy in this process, because you had to then project across people's lifetimes. So we had to build a model of what was going to happen across people's lifetimes and make quite a strong series of assumptions about the behaviours they were going to undertake and what relative interest rates were going to be, to show that indeed being obliged to save in a pension through automatic enrolment was going to produce an outcome better than they would have had by doing what you might reasonably alternatively assume. So it's not just a question, as I say, of saying you found a behavioural intervention will work. You've got to test it against all the classical economics disciplines of, is it going to be in the interest of the individual? Is it going to be the interest of the employer? Is it going to work for the society at large? And I think a lot of the other behavioural economics interventions that are introduced are not being thought through as scrupulously as that.
So in the case of pensions, they have been thought very carefully that it is for the best interest.
We didn't always get it right. And I'm sure there are people in the population for whom this will not necessarily be absolutely the best choice they could have made. What we did was reduce the margin of uncertainty about that down to a point where we could say, well, this is going to be a very small percentage of the population. Mm-hmm. In other cases, I'm not so sure. So I don't know, the move to presumed consent in the case of blood donation is I suppose the other big case that's current. I don't think that's been tested as carefully as it should be. I think the results in other countries suggest that you can get almost equally good results from a public policy perspective by providing people with more information. And where individuals' choices are overridden by presumed consent, you actually can build up quite a lot of resentment, because organ donation is such a personal thing. So I think there's always cross currents in this, and I don't think using behavioral economics in the way that we did in the pension space is necessarily safe in other spaces.
You were the intermediary, if you want, between leading figures of behavioral economics like David Lipson, who has also helped with the process of auto-enrollment. Is there anything you would like to add about this?
I suppose the main thing that was really striking was that this idea fell on such fertile ground. The idea of using automatic protocols for joining pension schemes had been around for quite some time under the rubric of accelerated joining. And I think we were also extremely fortunate in terms of what was going on in government at the time, that there was both the willingness to reach out to the experiences of other countries and learn from them, and the willingness to put considerably more resources. As I said to you at the beginning of this, I was the first chief economist for pensions. So there was a willingness on the part of government to up the resources that were going into the analysis of this major social issue, which hasn't always been the case. Indeed, the tendency has now been to cut numbers in the analytical parts of government, as I understand it. So there was this sense of a willing embrace both by the industry, because it saw, the pensions industry, it saw the potential gains for itself from a new approach that would bring many more people into pension savings and thus into buying insurance products, as well as a willingness on the part of government. And I suppose the other thing it fell in with was this notion of a third way, that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's government was very much seen as the government of the third way, that was neither socialist nor conservative in its outlook. It was new Labour. It was looking for new ways of doing things. And this kind of third way between compulsion and free choice actually fell quite neatly in that political spectrum as well. So it was an idea that was very appealing to a number of the special advisors in Number 10. I never spoke to Tony Blair himself, but I think it fell on fertile ground in that sense as well, that there was quite an interest in these new ways of doing things, and it was quite new at that stage. Actually, in the DWP, we were several years ahead of setting up the nudge unit in government. We were at the point of implementation when they were being established and looking for other things they might want to do.
Behavioral economics have been embraced by all political parties. Why do you think this had a cross-party consensus on this?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't obvious at the beginning that there would be a cross-party consensus, and keeping in discussion with Conservative spokesmen and shadow ministers under the Labour government was a critical part of building the consensus. And again, I think that the Pensions Commission managed very well. So whether it's because everybody's genuinely embraced behavioral economics, I don't know. I think the promise of behavioral economics is that it achieves, if you like, social goals without the need for huge amounts of government spending. So it's a form of interventionism without conventional tax and spend. So in a situation which governments have found themselves in, particularly since the financial crisis, it's an extremely appealing way out, or apparent way out of paradoxes where they would otherwise be stuck. So that's the appeal on the left. The appeal on the right is that you maintain an appearance of free choice while actually directing people quite strongly to an outcome. My concern about it, of course, is that that's equally compatible with an authoritarian view of government. That if you shape people's choices strongly enough, that actually works quite well for somebody who wants to tell people what to do. It was really important to us that it not be compulsion. And that was partly for reasons initially it was, I suppose, mostly for reasons to do with the way public accounts are constructed. That if you mandated contributions to a pension, it would be almost indistinguishable from a tax and spend solution. So we had to be very careful that the solution that was being designed was not one that was just going to become a tax and thus fall under Treasury control, that it would be something different and would remain under DWP control, which ultimately we did achieve, or was achieved. I can't say it was necessarily achieved by us. But the political philosophy, the advantages in terms of the political philosophy, I think was something that were, from my point of view, a bit of a byproduct of that. But then I feel I was probably quite innocent about the political ins and outs of what was going on.
Are there any reasons for which a hard compulsion was not appropriate?
Any analytical or political reasons? I mean, any reasons at all?
Any reasons at all, apart from considering as a tax which will be added to the national insurance contribution, which is also considered as a tax, etc.
So I think one of the things that was in my mind was indeed the situation which we came from, which was one where people had been encouraged to put all their trust in the state pension for a long time. And the Labour governments in the 1970s had brought in what was called the state earnings related pension or second state pension on top of the basic state pension. People had then been, if you like, lulled into a false sense of security. They were told that the state would take care of them in retirement. Then what supervened was 13 to 15 years of non-indexation and the state pension shriveling away in terms of its importance. So if you went back to a system where people were encouraged to put everything into the state pension, you then had to trust that the government would indeed come through on its promises. The implicit promise at the period of the state earnings related pension was that state pensions would remain adequate in relation to earnings. So it seemed an important part of people's diversification and not exposing them to too much risk, that they would have indeed some reasonably strong component of state pension, but also a reasonably strong component of private pension over which they had property rights, and which the state couldn't then change. So part of my background is that I worked in the World Bank beforehand, and I had experience of pension systems in Latin America, where, as you may be aware, there's a considerable tradition of basically stealing the assets out of pension schemes and the state taking over private pension schemes. I never thought that was going to happen in the UK if the money was indeed placed outside state control. I thought there was a much better chance of that money remaining genuinely the property of the beneficiaries rather than being the property of government, as is the case with the state pension system itself.
So let's now move on PADA and NEST. You were there when there was the idea of making a state-run DC scheme.
Our idea at the beginning was that it would be that all of the new system would be run by a single state-run agency. All of the auto-enrollment would go there, and that indeed the private industry would stand outside that. It was part of the engagement with stakeholders. So one of the stakeholder reactions was a very strong reaction by the insurance companies that they saw themselves as having well, they certainly had a strong commercial interest in being providers within the new scheme. I can't tell you that much about how the ins and outs of how they influenced the process, but they've been very strong stakeholders of government for a long time in the pensions business. Indeed, one way of looking at the whole pensions business is that it was delivered by industry on behalf of government. So I don't know how far back you look historically. For me, the beginning of this process was in the 1960s, when inflation, and into the 70s, when inflation became rapid, and particularly when marginal personal tax rates were very high. So if you were a high-income individual in the 1960s, you were faced with a personal tax rate that could be as high as 83% on your earned income. So what pension schemes offered to particularly high-paid people at that point was the chance to have a part of your income outside the tax net. And that was extraordinarily advantageous at that time. And that's what really built, in my view, the big bulk of Britain's private pension system was the huge tax advantages of private pensions at that time. Correspondingly, as tax rates came down under the Thatcher governments and later on, the tax advantages of private pensions disappeared. So insurers and employers found themselves operating a system that was less and less to the advantage of the high-wage employees who'd initially been a strong lobby for it. And they were facing a bit of an uphill struggle, if you like, in pushing something that had become an objective of government policy, to have a strong private pension system. So there's probably some element of horse trading here, if you like. We've been making a big effort to do the heavy lifting on private pensions for many years. You're now about to make a change to policy, auto-enrollment, that's going to make that heavy lifting a great deal easier. But we want some of that action. That's how I feel about it. Whether that's actually I don't imagine the dialogue took place in those terms behind closed doors in the ministers' offices, but that's, I think, what was ultimately going on.
On the other hand, there was a need for an authority to be developed in order to design this state-run pension scheme, which was the personal...
the so-called personal accounts
the so-called,
yeah.
But this authority was not run by the existing civil servants.
Well, there were two things. Partly it was a recognition the skills weren't there in government to set up what was eventually going to be a pension provider. So we had no skills in things like fund management at all, or customer communication or whatever. That, yes, the state pension system was run from within DWP, but it was very old-fashioned and clunky, and we found it very hard even to tell people what their state pension rights were. So we knew there were considerable limits on our own administrative systems, even though the DWP was disbursing something like £1 billion a week in state pensions. It didn't see itself as state of the art. I think the other thing to remember is that at that time there was quite I don't know what I want to call a fashion, a trend for setting up independent organizations. So the parallel reform, which was looking at the security of private pensions, private occupational pensions, set up 3 of them. The pension regulator, the pension protection fund, and indeed the body that ultimately oversaw the compensation of people who'd lost money in the state pension scheme, in private pension schemes. So there was quite a lot of thinking about how do we set up these organizations to best advantage. So there was a lot of intellectual capital, if you like, in DWP and Treasury for building new organizations and thinking, okay, those are the purposes. Let's not bring it within central government, which is kind of rule-bound, but let's set it up in a new way so it can write its own rule book.
Mm-hmm. And the purpose was to make a scheme that will look like the already existing private personal pension schemes?
So there were different ideas at different times. I mean, if you think about where the name personal accounts came from, that was the concept of privatizing Social Security under George Bush's presidency in the United States. The idea that you would take Social Security contributions and invest them, instead of putting them into a pay-as-you-go state pension system, you would put them into private funds where people could have ownership over them. So that was where the language of personal accounts came from. And that at some stages, at least in the early thinking, was something that could conceivably have happened, that you would just divert state pension contributions into building up a private pension. That didn't ultimately happen, and I think it's probably a good thing it didn't happen. But that was certainly considered. The other thing, as I say, was it was going to be like a private organization in terms of its capabilities, but it was not going to have a profit motive, because one of the really important things about setting up effectively personal pensions for the whole gamut of people, not just people at the high end of the spectrum, but people very much at the low wage end, part-time workers, people with on not much more than minimum wage, was you're going to have a vast variety of sizes of pension fund. And from the point of view of an insurance company, only the big ones are profitable to run, so they're in a cross-subsidy business. And they're very keen to avoid taking on too many small savers. So we see this very much, for example, in the Zurich IGC, where I currently am. The vast bulk of the funds are from a relatively small proportion of the savers, but a lot of the costs come from administering the many small savers you inevitably drag in. So from the point of view of a private business, the thing to do is to try and target as much as possible the big savers. So one of the things we feared was that if it was left to private companies, they would target the big savers and leave the small ones on one side. But the aim of public policy, and John Hills and Jeannie Drake were particularly strong on this, was that it had to be filling the gap for people on relatively low wages, who were the ones who were facing the most serious pension shortfall.
Why Nest could have been a problem for the pensions industry?
And I suppose the most conventional view is that there's a subsidized competitor. There's nothing to stop it for bidding for the big expensive mandates or the big high profit mandates alongside the less profitable ones. Mm-hmm. So I think a private company operating in this market would say, okay, well, here's a state subsidized competitor doing something which I could do equally well, and they're going to take my business away.
There were 2 options on the table before Nest was formed. It was the current system, the National Pension Savings Scheme, which was called then, And there was a provider choice model. Why do you think it was preferred, the first option?
Well, if you like, I think the industry got exactly what it wanted, which was to be in a position where it was absolved of the need to take on these unattractive scheme members, but also have the right to compete for the more profitable and attractive parts of it. So the way it ultimately got set up, with Nest as the provider of last resort and private companies able to compete for the business, gave them the best of both worlds.
Another important reform was the introduction of a flat rate state pension. Do you think this reform affects the framework that the private pensions are working?
Oh, absolutely. No, one of our primary concerns at the beginning of this was the incentives that faced people. As I say, the question of pays to save, whether it pays you to save. And one of the things that raises real questions about that, or at that time raised real questions about that, particularly for lower income people, was the idea that they might save a little bit for their pension, which would then reduce their entitlement to means-tested benefits in retirement, to pension credit. So pension credit was seen as a real obstacle to increasing people's private pension saving. So at the beginning of this process, any of us think that the state pension system could possibly be changed, because, as I say, it lay with Treasury, it lay with Gordon Brown. Pension credit had been his brainchild, and in some ways it's a brilliant solution to the problem of pensioner poverty, because it targets scarce public resources onto the most needy group of people. But it has this side effect that it destroys or compromises incentives to save. So yes, it was a fundamental thing, the incentive to save and the role of pension credit in undermining those incentives.
Do you think this will affect the operations of the industry?
Well, it would take some time to do so. And I suppose the fundamental contradiction that had happened was that the level of the state pension had dropped below the poverty line in the period running up to the pension commission being established. And it was that gap, the fact that you could be on a full state pension and still be living in poverty, that led to the establishment of pension credit in the first place, because that was felt to be such a socially unsustainable outcome, that you paid a benefit that didn't actually bring people above the level they needed to live on. State pensions now had to fall a long way, I think, to get you back into that situation. But I think one would be very worried if you saw the process starting again of state pensions dipping to that point where they couldn't keep people out of poverty, because essentially government would be forced to respond in something like the same way. And when I expounded this academically, if you like, in a lecture audience, it was very interesting to put it up as the standard policy triangle. There are three objectives here: incentives, government finance, and adequate pensions. And you can't satisfy them all completely all the time. And it's quite neat, almost decade by decade, you see the British government running from one pole to the other. So in the 1970s, in the name of adequacy, a lot more money was spent, so the public finance objective was lost. Then under Thatcher, the public finance objective became paramount, public pensions were cut, and incentives began to disappear. And then coming back under Brown, not incentives began to disappear, the pension of poverty began to increase. Under Brown, money was put into these targeted schemes, and pension of poverty was addressed, but incentives began to disappear. So we'd come back by the end of the pension credit period, if you like, to where the Labour government had started out in the 1970s. And the question for the Pensions Commission was, how do you find something that's a reasonable solution to all three of those objectives? Because you can't have them all completely at any one time.
I would like to close with your current role. And I would like to ask you, we have seen another important measure, which is the introduction of an independence governance committee in these workplace private schemes. How do you think this is related with these main reforms that we discussed? I mean, the flat rate state pension, the auto-enrollment, the creation of Nest. Is there any relation?
I guess it feels to me tangential. It seems to me that it comes much more out of a long-running interest of the financial regulator in making sure that private pensions operate somewhat as a market. And you'll be aware of the Office of Fair Trading report, which concluded that defined contribution pensions had the weakest demand side of any financial product market they looked at. The financial regulators have been interested for quite a long time in price capping pensions. They brought in the 1% annual management charge price cap on stakeholder pensions sometime earlier. Then they brought in regulatory updates that essentially obliged effectively new schemes to meet that standard. And that's a price cap of that kind is a fairly blunt instrument. The independent governance committees are trying to make sure that people get value for money, meaning that within their price cap, if they're price cap products, or more generally if they're not, people are getting the level of service, the quality of investment management, and so forth that they really need.
Great. Do you think these questions have captured your views on these pension reforms? Would you like to add anything else?
Okay. One of the moments I had most satisfaction of was any time I talked about stuff that I felt we'd developed in DWP, and they thought they'd developed it themselves. If you like, everything we did, people subsequently came to think was their idea. And I think that's one of the things that worked really, really well, that everybody could feel they had a hand in developing the set of ideas that had come from what they'd thought. So there was something powerfully intuitive. And I don't know how far this is down to the Pensions Commission. I think Adair and Jeannie and John Hills were particularly brilliant at starting from the analytical point of view and setting out the analytical case so that, if you like, the result emerged as something intuitive and obvious. They played that case very, very well. They just let the answer emerge from the evidence. Okay. And that established the credibility in people's minds, almost regardless of whether this was automatic enrollment or anything else.